What I did after very full deliberation and under a heavy and solemn sense of responsibility. I can only trust in God that I have made no mistake. Abraham Lincoln, 1862. After release in September following the Battle of Antietam, the Emancipation Proclamation was officially issued on January 1, 1863. The proclamation freed all slaves living in states of rebellion. Lincoln believed that the Constitution protected slavery, so it was originally done as a strategic military action, given that the rebels were using slavery as an advantage in war, and they were. The Confederates were using slaves for hard labor, digging trenches, building roads. In theory, the Emancipation Proclamation would help the Union win the war. However, it was quickly realized that a statement was not all that it would take to assimilate foreigner slaves into a life of independence. Lincoln is remembered as the Great Emancipator. While the reactions to the proclamation varied, many people referred to him by this title. At first, many Northerners flocked to help the newly freed slaves. An author for the New York Times wrote, "Suddenly 100,000 of emancipated slaves appealed to Northern benevolence. Some ask for clothing, some want food. Large numbers are old, infirm, diseased, and require homes and medical aid. There is a willingness in the philanthropic North to aid in this humane work. All seem ready to help." While this portrayed the generosity many were willing to offer, it is a good indication of just how little the former slaves had. The same author points out later in the article that there needed to be a plan set up for integrating the slaves. People argued that if the North provided everything to them, they would never get used to being independent, and it would end up hurting both them and the North in the long run. To be fair, the slaves were not all emancipated at once. Many slaveholders had freed their slaves on their own terms prior to the proclamation. In the years before the war, a man named McDonough freed his slaves by setting up a deal with them. Monday through Saturday they would work for him, but on Sundays they would be paid. Once they saved up enough money, they could buy Monday and then Tuesday and so on until they had essentially bought their own freedom. But the main effort McDonough was trying to make was to determine whether or not emancipated slaves could take care of themselves. It soon became clear that while they were very determined to receive their freedom, once they got it, many were unsure of what to do next. So what exactly happened to the African Americans after the proclamation? It was expected that many would end up going to fight for the Union. One of the most famous black regiments was the 54th Massachusetts. It was formed in March of 1863, and a man named Jacob Christie wrote into a letter to his sister shortly after joining in May. "I take my pen in hand to inform you that I am well, and all the rest of them are well, and we are very well pleased with soldiering." However, in a later letter, Christie's tone had changed. He complains that his regiment isn't being used in battle, even though they were very prepared to. He also notes the pay, saying, "We have not been paid anything since we have been in the field. They have offered to pay us, but did not want to give us as much as the white soldiers, and so we won't or wouldn't take any." Overall, while the 54th Massachusetts did become famous for their hard work many years later, using blacks in the military did not go as well as Lincoln originally hoped. Many of the men that ended up volunteering were free Northerners who had never been slaves in the first place. And once they did join the army, their regiments were treated with much less respect than the white regiments. And what about those who didn't join the army? Many didn't truly receive their freedom until the war was over for good. While the Emancipation Proclamation provided the framework for freeing the slaves, there was still a lot of work to do. It did not state that former slaves would become citizens, and since it was done as a military action, it didn't outlaw slavery altogether. Slavery remained in the border states who never left the Union in the first place. And that's not to say that the southern states just automatically obeyed either. Because the area that the Emancipation Proclamation applied to was still in a state of rebellion, it was difficult to get it enforced to begin with. While the proclamation was robust in theory, there was still much that needed to be done before the war would be over and the former slaves could be properly integrated. But the proclamation, as law, either is valid or is not valid. If it is not valid, it needs no retraction. If it is valid, it cannot be retracted any more than the dead can be brought back to life. Abraham Lincoln, 1863.